Who indeed was Johannes Pullois? Of his early life, we don't know very much. He was probably born around the early 1420s. Because of his name, he may have been from the town of Pullois, which is just a small town east of Antwerp. He first shows up in the records in 1443. He was a choral vicar and singing master, or zangmeester, at the Collegiate Church of Our Lady in Antwerp, which of course is now the cathedral, but in the 15th century, Antwerp was part of the Diocese of Cambrai. We might assume, though we don't know this for certain, that he received his musical education at the same church. He actually became choral vicar there at the same time as did Johannes Ockeghem, his more famous contemporary. And he continues his association with Ockeghem later in his life. As a young musician, he was clearly very ambitious, and we see this just a few years after he joined as a choral vicar at the Church of Our Lady. He auditioned to join the illustrious Burgundian court chapel of Philip the Good. For whatever reason, and we don't know what it was, but he was unsuccessful in this. But his ambitions did not stop. So the next year, in 1447, he leaves the Church of Our Lady in Antwerp, and he goes to Rome. He moves to Rome. He arrives there in the summer of 1447, and then by the end of the year, he's received as a member of the papal chapel. So he followed his disappointment in Burgundy with success in Rome. And he remained there at the papal chapel for the following 20 years, again, from 1447 until 1468. One of the things he was notable for in Rome, he was very good at navigating canon law and curial bureaucracy, and this he used for his own financial benefit and that of some others. He was perhaps the most successful composer of his generation, of any one in the 15th century, in terms of acquiring benefices. Benefices, as you may know, these were positions at churches around Europe which would provide an income. And so then with that income, you'd use a portion of that income to hire someone to fulfill the duties, but you would receive most of the income for yourself. So with 13 benefices in the diocese of Cambrai and Utrecht, he was one of, if not the richest musicians of the entire century. And so in fact his will survives today in Antwerp. He had 3 illegitimate sons. He left them all generous provision. He also had various charitable bequests, and he arranged for an annual requiem mass in his memory. He also managed to obtain a couple of benefices for Ockeghem, who he knew from the earlier days in Antwerp. So then, after his 20 years in the papal chapel, he returns once again to Antwerp in 1468, and he remains there for the final decade of his life before passing away in 1478, once again affiliated with the Church of Our Lady as a canon. You've probably not heard of Pullois, and why is that? I guess if you look at some of the notable literature about Pullois, and so one of the scholars who spent a lot of time in Pullois, Peter Gülke, a German conductor and musicologist, early in his career, he edited the complete works of Pullois. And you get some great quotes from Peter Gülke, who says, his works represent a sort of mediocre level over which the achievements of Dufay, Binchois, and others rise so remarkably. He says, Pullois was no innovator seeking after bold or original solutions to problems. Likewise, it seems not impossible that Pullois's contemporaries may have detected in his work a dry, schoolmasterish tone, which is my favorite. And this continues then with another one of the scholars who is most responsible for Pullois's biography, Pamela Starr, an American musicologist, who starts in her dissertation on music and musical patronage in Rome in the mid-15th century, she starts her discussion about Pullois by saying that he is admittedly a lesser Renaissance Kleinmeister. And so why these relatively dismissive comments? I think there are potentially two reasons, maybe three, but two to start off with, is that he wasn't always successful, right? He tried to get into the Burgundian court chapel, but he failed. He was rejected from that, even though he followed that up with great success in his career moving to Rome. But he wasn't a Josquin who was in demand everywhere. And secondly, what Pullois is perhaps most famous for is that he was mentioned in the treatise Proportionale Musices by Johannes Tinctoris, a music theorist from the second half of the 15th century. Tinctoris doesn't like his use of proportions. The details are unimportant, but he criticizes an instance in the music of Guillaume le Rouge and then also of Pullois. And then he compares that to Guillaume Dufay, who uses proportions in the correct way. But he was a proponent of certain ideas concerning notation which were not standard in musical practice. So at the time when Pullois was writing, he and this is specifically concerning his usage of major prolation, he used major prolation to indicate a proportional change. But Tinctoris was a proponent of what Anna Maria Busseberger calls the equal minim, where one minim is the same, whether it's in major or minor prolation. Dufay did use this equal minim, but Pullois and Le Rouge did not. They had the use of major prolation imply a proportional change. So it's not a question of who's right or not. It didn't align with Tinctoris's theory, but it was standard musical practice when Pullois was using that sort of notational tool. So this criticism, again, is one of the things for which Pullois is most famous. And yet Tinctoris then goes on to refer to all three of these composers, so Pullois, along with Guillaume le Rouge and Guillaume Dufay, as tres famosissimi compositores, three most famous composers. So again, to judge him simply on the basis of criticism is a bit unfair. The output of Pullois, his work output, is not as substantial as some other composers of his day. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why this concert will be so interesting. Perhaps one advantage of dealing with a composer who is less well known is that in the course of one evening we can experience his full range of styles in a single musical personality. The concert, again, consists of all of the music by this composer, but the majority of this music is songs, and specifically French songs, more specifically French rondeaux. The rondeau is one of the form fixe of the 15th century, and prior and after, but one of the most common ways of composing songs were in these form fixe, and it contains a specific textual and musical form that the composer had to follow. In one case, that's quelque langage, the entire text of the rondeau survives, but in most cases we only have the textual refrain. So I don't know, the singers and performers will have to decide precisely how to deal with the lack of text. In some cases, you only get the incipit, and in at least one source, there's no text whatsoever. Two of the surviving rondeaux that they will sing, that they will perform, are not French at all, but in fact Dutch, and that's Op een tijd and Zo lang zo meer. Again, it's only the refrain that exists, so they will have to figure out how to make this into a musical form. So two of these rondeaux survive with Latin contrafect texts. One of them has a full French text, quelque chose, and then also the Latin text, globus igneus. And that will be sung or performed in both French and Latin versions. In the second one, only the French incipit survives, so the Latin text, ragione unice, is the only full text that survives, and that is the only version that we will hear. Finally, two of the rondos were also arranged for organ intabulation. So they survive both in vocal versions and then in this instrumental version, specifically in the Buxheimer Orgelbuch. And Sollazzo will perform both versions, the original texted versions as well as the intabulated versions. And the final song that they will perform is a sacred ballade. This is La Bonté du Saint-Esprit, or the goodness of the Holy Spirit, which is in fact also an occasional work which is dedicated to an unnamed pope. Beyond these songs, there are three sacred works that Sollazzo will perform, and the first and the most simple of these is Victime Pascali Laudes. This work is a short work. It's also incomplete, so the full thing doesn't exist. The melody is found in the top voice. There are three voices in total, so the lower voices then harmonize the melody of the sequence, which, if you know it, and more or less everyone would have been familiar with this melody in the 15th century, then it would be very recognizable. So it's a relatively simple setting, but it does have some lively triple rhythms to accompany the simple counterpoint. The two musical bookends of the concert are the two other sacred works, and one of them is Pullois's only real motet, that's Flos de Spina, which comes at the beginning of the concert. These two pieces, Flos de Spina and the Gloria at the end, are also the only works that Pullois composed in four voices. Everything else in the concert was just for three voices. So these are striking in different ways. Flos de Spina survives in five sources from the 15th century. Notable about these five sources is that at least two of them would have been copied after Pullois's death. It was copied in Milan in one of the giant choir books that was copied for the cathedral in Milan in the 1480s. And then it was copied in Capilla Sistina 15, that's in Rome, copied in the late 1490s, so a good 20 years after Pullois's death, for use in the Capilla Sistina in Rome. The text of the motet, Flos de Spina, it's a sequence. In fact, there are a number of sequences which start with this same text, Flos de Spina, from the 13th century and beyond, some of which survive in chant sources. These are all Marian sequences. Some of them would have been more specifically sung during Advent. And indeed, the motet, as we have it, is a Marian piece, which some have also referred to as a Christmas motet, as it refers specifically to the birth of Christ as well. The text is identical to a two-voice conductus that was copied in the 13th century, in 13th century sources. But unfortunately, the music is unrelated. So the music we see in the motet, as far as I've been able to see, the tenor is not based on any surviving chant melodies, but it nevertheless looks like a fairly straightforward tenor motet. In four voices, the tenor is slow-moving. It forms most of the contrapuntal cadences with the soprano. It's in two parts, so it's a substantial work. Like most other motets of the time, it started in tempus perfectum, and then it moves to a faster tempus imperfectum. While the counterpoint, and again, Pullois was not used to composing in four voices, the counterpoint can be slightly irregular, but it's nevertheless an extremely elegant work with long flowing lines and long duets between different pairs of the voices. The second of those two pieces, the piece which will end the concert, is a Gloria. And this is a single movement from a Mass, right, that would be sung as part of the Mass ordinary. But it's not part of a larger Mass. It exists, it's a standalone Gloria. In the mid-15th century, it was actually much more common for Mass movements to exist, to be composed as individual movements and not as part of a cyclic Mass, as becomes standard by the end of the century. So this is a single movement, which is found in only a single source, where it's given a heading Pullois Fuga. But this is not, in fact, a title, it's just a rubric, because the top voice in this piece is a canon. It's a perfect canon at the unison. If you're looking at the source, it looks like it's only in 3 voices, but in fact this top voice has to be sung by 2 different voices, offset by a certain amount of time. But I'm excited to hear Sollazzo do this. Like the motet, it's in 2 parts, and the first part in tempus perfectum, the second part in tempus imperfectum. And this technique where we have this canon in the top voice, it's unusual, but it is found elsewhere. And in fact, in the same source, we also see a more famous piece by Guillaume Dufay, his Gloria ad modum tubae. Dufay's Gloria is actually given a different heading. It's called Dufay Fuga Duorum Temporum. And again, Fuga Duorum Temporum is simply a rubric which states that the 2 canonic voices are to enter offset by 2 tempuses, which in this case would be 2 breves or a single long of time. These are both extremely striking pieces. I'm excited to have Sollazzo singing them and to hear what they will do with the paired repeats in the upper voices. It has the potential to be really, really exciting. So for those of you who have attended Sollazzo performances in the past, you know that they can really be an event, and they frequently perform music that is very unfamiliar to us, often music that is unrecorded or underperformed, but that maybe really should be. So one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited for this concert is that I can think of no better champion for Pullois than Sollazzo. A group that will perform this music and make the rest of us want to get to know that music better. So in the years to come, when Pullois has finally become a household name for early music enthusiasts, we may have this concert to look back to as the new beginning